Got it.
All right. So picking up where we never left off, we we had noticed that the last couple times we had been recording that the topic of women's wrestling or a women's division in a wrestling promotion uh, routinely came up, and that there was quite a bit to talk about when it comes to the modern women's division and the history of women's wrestling.
Yes. And women's wrestling right now has never been more hotter on both brands, actually, all brands. Every brand right now has a women's wrestler that is top of the line. We're talking like top of the line performer.
Yeah.
Not top of the line women, top of the line performer. So
Yeah.
I'm really happy to talk about this subject today.
Yep. When do you know when we first started to see women's wrestling being added on to a event card?
Well, are you talking in history, or are you talking like when we were kids?
No, like in history, when did we start to see women's wrestling or women's a women's division where there was a champion, even if it was just that one woman who was presented on TV, like as part of the product, as the women's champion for a promotion?
Well, in women's wrestling in general, women's wrestling more came about. Almost see the movie League of Their Own, right? Where there was a women's baseball league started because the men were at war, right? Same with the women's wrestling. Women's wrestling, and that's when the carnival sideshow, the freak show matches, basically, like where we mentioned the Swedish Angel or the French Angel, also with like like the heavy set fellas, you know what I mean, like
Attraction wrestlers.
right, like the big hillbilly kind of wrestlers,
Yeah.
all of that came about due to the war. And when I mean the war, like World War One, World War II, like time period. And that's when a lot of women's wrestlers came to be, and the division came to be. Women's wrestling was put on the map by a promoter named Buddy Lee. And Buddy Lee was married to the Fabulous Moolah for many, many years. And they had together, they had a kind of, I want to say not a racket, but kind of, they kind of had a monopoly on women's wrestling, because Moolah would train women, and it would just keep going on and on and on. Also, before that, you had other women's wrestlers before that, but it really became like a business, I would say, when the Fabulous Moolah came into the business, and Fabulous Moolah, Buddy Lee. Now, some can date back and say, "Oh, Mildred Burke, was one of the first," and Mildred Burke was a badass woman who was a shooter, back in her day, but as much of a lady as any other lady. Had an abusive husband / promoter on her end, and thankfully in her lifetime dropped him eventually. But it was more like Mildred wasn't like Moolah. Moolah was more business minded. You know what I mean? In my opinion, she had she found a way to train other women over the years and kind of make a business for herself. And of course, she would take her commission for every woman she would train. So, she was all about, you know what I mean? Like, there was no false advertisement in the Fabulous Moolah. She was all about the Moolah. So
and a lot of that has come out more recently in most prominently in my mind would be like Dark Side of the Ring, about the nature of Moolah and women's wrestling. And we find ourselves saying this a lot. It was a different business back then. And that's not to give a pass on bad people doing bad things. It was just a different era. And this
and,
isn't
and
a moral autopsy of the past. It is just a discussion about history.
no, and to summarize it, in all fairness, in in popular culture, whether it was movies, television, etc., and lifestyle, it was just a different beast. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like women were treated very different back then, as opposed to now, where it's a little, it's actually way better. Back then, it was very, very, very hedonistic. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And there was black and white back then. There was no gray area. It was like women are here, men are here. Men are the providers, women are the housewives who stay at home and, you know what I mean, serve the men, which no. So,
Well, and things like World War II did help break open a lot of different opportunities and a lot of different lifestyles to be able to come out in American culture.
yes, and that famous poster, which is still reprinted all over the world, the "We Can Do It" poster with the woman posing,
Yeah.
which was a big, symbol at the time, and still, I mean, I think that's why it's still reprinted today. It still resonates with a lot of people, especially independent women.
I want to
So
say she was a musician for like a cello or a violin. She was a very renowned uh, symphony musician. I can't remember. Do you know anything about that?
no, I only know and honestly no, and I'm ashamed not to know, but I do know of that poster art, what it represents. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? And trust me, that part resonated with me.
yeah,
So and that's what I took away from it was, here I am woman, hear me roar, and
yeah. And again,
again,
that yeah, it would
that still resignates today.
yeah, because regardless of the personal life, the idea of that poster was to say to 30s and 40s American culture, the the world is changing right now in World War II. It's changing uh, to never be the same again, but hopefully in a good way. And it represented um, a new home model and a new family model to take us out of there into where I do think that culture needed to be.
Yes. And to get back to Mula, I mean, yes, Dark Side of the Ring has come out, and a lot of not so nice things have been said about her, which, that's it came to surface to the mainstream. If you were within the know of pro wrestling, that wasn't, you know what I mean? That's like the Ric Flair thing on the plane. That's public
Yeah,
knowledge. If you were a wrestling fan, you knew about that stuff like that.
yeah,
um, Mula had been doing that stuff for years. And, them I don't know what it was where that news piece came out. And then all of a sudden, the fabulous Mula Memorial Battle Royal changed, you know what I mean? Overnight. And
yeah,
because somebody sent the email to the sponsor of, I believe it was Snickers. And it was like, oh, how can you put her name on that? It's like, to me, whether Mula's business practices were good, bad, or indifferent, you know what I mean? You can't deny the legacy she left on women's wrestling, what she brought to the table as far as women's wrestling went, the people she trained, and the fact of the matter is you can't erase somebody like that. It's
yeah,
just she was her mitts were too much into that. um how do you say the groundbreaking part
yeah,
of women's wrestling?
yeah. And you can celebrate the uh, the influence that she had on the business and the uh, all the women who she was able to introduce into the business through there. We do have in our own culture selective outrage.
Yeah, and then let me just say this, okay? No different than what the Click did in the 90s, where they all wanted to work with their friends, and keep the belts within themselves and the top spots within themselves, right?
Yeah,
Mula was no different. She had the people she trained, and she wanted to keep all the money and everything within her camp. You know what I mean? The Moolah Buddy Lee camp.
Yeah.
It's no different. That's been going on in pro wrestling for years. So
Yeah.
it's again, I just think people need to get off their high horse and really open their eyes and look,
Yeah.
because history tends to repeat itself over and over and over again. It did with Buddy Rogers and Buddy Rogers camp. You know what I mean? Like keeping the belt within the Buddy Rogers camp. You had the Click, you had the Hogan camp. You know what I mean? So it's like you had guys over the years. They may not have. How do you say? They were a little more cunning than people gave them credit for, but they had a reason for it.
A lot of politicking.
Yes, and they wanted to keep the top money in the top spots. And you get in pro wrestling. Kevin Nash said it best. You get in pro wrestling to make the most money, and or actually no, scratch that. Kurt Hennig, because he was the influence on the Click. He said you get in to get out of it, right? And you get in to make the most money to get out of it. So,
Yep.
But the problem is getting out of it, which
Yeah.
most wrestlers have, because they're always chasing that big payday or that big,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? The dangling carrot. So,
well, and even the guys who were in there for a paycheck, the adrenaline rush you would get walking out to a stadium crowd at some pay-per-view, likely WrestleMania,
mhm.
cannot be bought or recreated anywhere else except for that, in that moment, at that time, at that place.
Yep. And we've both been a part of our own WrestleManias, so we know what that big crowd reaction is like. You know what I mean? On a grand scale.
Yeah. All right. So we have Moolah. When did we first, as far as we understand, when did we first start to see that this influence that Moolah had, or her racket that she had set up with all the other women wrestlers that she was training?
Probably as early as the it was in the 1950s when it really, really became a big business. And Moolah was its world champion. And this was the big, what was it, 28-year reign or something ridiculous like that, which, in all fairness, I'm sure she, it's like Ric Flair's, 16 world titles. I think it's like more like 20 or something like that. History has been rewritten over the years and kind of embellished and all that stuff. See Pat Patterson winning the IC belt Rio de Janeiro, like stuff like that.
Wasn't it the same with Buddy Rogers and the WWF title?
Also wanted in Rio de Janeiro. I mean, man, all these events that Rio de Janeiro got that we didn't,
Yeah.
These tournaments, these events. But no, she pretty much, Moolah kept up that practice. Now, in the beginning, I mentioned Buddy Lee because he, on top of being a wrestling promoter, he was also a country music promoter too. And he and Moolah had a good business practice for many, many, many years. And of course, Buddy Lee ended up cheating on Moolah with another female wrestler, ended up marrying that other female wrestler. Moolah took what she learned from Buddy Lee in the 50s and 60s, and created a business for herself. And then eventually opened her Moolah Drive, Moolah Ranch, where she trained multiple female wrestlers over the years, the likes of Lalani Kai, was it trying to think, Wendy Richter, was it Ariel Littlefeather? I want to say it was one of the Indian like Indian type wrestlers. So it was just countless women's wrestling wrestlers that she had her hands in. Judy Martin, like all the old time women wrestlers. Unless they had a family member that was in the business already, they were all trained by Moolah. So pretty much all the old female wrestlers you saw. Velvet McIntyre is another one. I just thought of her. These names are all just popping up as I'm talking, but
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
So who did if Mula is the champion for 28 years,
Yep.
who was her who who was she working a program with to be able to go out to events and later TV to create a crowd for this? Like she can't just be the champion by herself, except in Rio de Janeiro. And
Yeah,
then show up and expect to draw money.
it was always just a revolving door of Mula trainees, honestly, and she never had like one giant long, I would say giant long program per se.
Mm,
That stuff didn't come up until like because and the reason for that was women's matches were more of an attraction match on the card. They weren't meant to do storylines and
yeah,
stuff like that back then. That's how the wrestling business worked. It worked the same way with midgets, um, or little people to be PC.
yeah,
But they were called midget wrestlers back then.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and same with the freak shows or like the hillbillies, like you see your Haystacks Calhoun or your McGuire twins or whatever, but
Elmer.
they weren't. Yeah, they weren't meant to. They weren't. They never had programs on anybody. It was a revolving door of Mula trainees that she just happened to work with, and she would get these. Like I said, she would book these women out to different promoters and take a commission fee, from each woman for training them. So, which that was standard practice back then. Most Vern is known for doing that, with his wrestlers and multiple others that were the old school trainers because that was part of quote unquote paying your dues.
Yeah,
So, but yeah, to answer your question, there was no particular storylines. Storylines in women's wrestling didn't really, in my mind, didn't really happen until the 80s when, Vince was really starting that rock and wrestling thing. You had your Moolah and Wendy Richter doing that storyline, and they were doing the whole like old guard versus the young and up and coming,
yeah.
you know,
Which
and
was a
and when
big, yeah, and that was a big part of the 80s culture, uh, uh, challenging the old to come in uh, with the new. So I think that's very fitting for the
yeah,
era.
and Mullah at that time was in her 50s. So back in the 1980s. So, and Wendy was like probably mid 20s, early 30s. So, and Wendy was trained young, uh, you know, late 70s, early 80s by Mullah initially. And, but broke away from Mullah's camp and kind of made it on her own and became her own little name in general. And, of
That would
course,
backfire.
Wendy. What's that?
That would backfire.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In a horrible way, but for a slight little bit in history, I mean, she was a big deal, and also Wendy back in her prime was actually a very fetching looking woman in comparison to the other women's wrestlers that they had. So not
Mm,
only was she tough, but she was also very, very good looking, which that would be a standard going forward in WWF/WWE
yeah.
uh, with different women's wrestlers. So, and which would eventually become the Divas division
Yep.
of the late 90s, early 2000s. So,
What do you know of the original Montreal with Wendy Richter and the fabulous Moolah?
oh, the MSG screw job. Now, there's been several stories on this. Uh, some now the original Spider Lady was Cora Combs, which was another Moolah trainee, and now it was Wendy says she knew it was Moolah under the mask, but I find I don't know. It's so to me it's so strange because like if you knew it was Moolah, then why go through with the match? Like something is amiss with me.
Hmm.
I I can't tell what is the real story. Wendy insists that she knew it was Moolah the moment she got in the ring with her, and they were going to try something funny but why would, if Wendy was, the tough, why would she let her get away with it? Or if she knew it was Moolah, why would she let her get away with it? So
Yeah.
I think, honestly, I don't think maybe Moolah had a part in getting the belt off of her, like with that screw job thing, but I think that was more of a Vince and Wendy thing because Wendy got a little too big for her britches. She was paired with Cyndi Lauper. She thought she was number 2 to Hogan, which she was popular. Don't get me wrong, but she was no Hulk Hogan. Not in
No.
1985, 1986. No way.
Yeah.
So maybe it was a case of Vince trying to knock her down a peg. You know what I mean? And Moolah just happened to be kind of like the woman caught in the middle, basically, to
Yeah.
do the dirty work for the promoter. So
Yeah.
because
They,
Moolah she never said no to Vince Senior or Junior, on doing anything. That's
yeah.
why Moolah has been put in the most ridiculous situations over the years and kind of made the best of it if you really think about it.
Yeah. And so Wendy had the WWF Women's Championship, and she was
Yep.
put in there, and Moolah was going to take it off her.
Yep.
She was going to go into business for herself while probably
Yep.
going into business for the McMahons.
Yes. And they got the belt off her, and apparently Wendy yelled a bunch of obscenities at Vince and left the arena with her hockey bag over her shoulder, and she was still in her gear, and never came back ever again.
Yep.
So, and they got the belt off her. They meaning Vince McMahon and the WWF.
Yep.
So
going out of the 80s and going into the 90s, we start to see, as technology is improving, we're going to start to see sometimes hit or miss features with women's wrestlers. Are going to start to see them pop up on pay-per-views back into the day. What is going on? Not just in the WWF, but primarily there where it's being broadcasted and you can get it on pay-per-view. But what's going on with women's wrestling? Maybe not necessarily a women's division yet, but women in professional wrestling in the early 90s.
Early 90s. So let's backtrack just a couple of years, like to the late 80s. Now, it seemed that WWF was trying to get the right idea going with establishing a women's division. If you remember, Velvet McIntyre comes in not too long after Wendy Richter. Velvet, if you remember, had the crimped long hair, you know what I mean? And she worked a lot with Moolah. That still wasn't enough. Then they brought in Sensational Sherry, who was another Moolah trainee, you know what I mean? And broke off on her own and became a big star in her own right. And of course, she wins the title. And they bring in Jake the Snake Roberts' sister, Rockin' Robin, to work with her. And Rockin' Robin, of course, and Sherry have the feud. But it was still more treated like a attraction match than it was. I mean, they had storyline because it was the WWF and it was the late 80s. So there had to be some investment. Meanwhile, you had the Glamour Girls, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai versus the Jumping Palm Angels. They were trying to establish a tag team division, but they only had 2 teams. The Glamour Girls being the champs, and then eventually the Jumping Palm Angels being the champs. You switch the belts between the 2 teams all the time. You really can't establish a division there. So it kind of was like, it was a lot like Big Show's runs. It was start stop. You know what I mean? Or take start stop. So flash forward into the early 90s, they try reestablishing the women's division again because after Sensational Sherry wins the title back from Rockin' Robin, the belt like basically just becomes dormant, for a few years. And Sherry goes on to managing, and she was a quite successful manager with Macho Man and $1 Million Man and Shawn and all those guys. But flash forward to 1993, you have Medusa, who comes in from WCW, Medusa Michelli, changed her name to Alundra Blaze, and that was the one that Vince was going to strap the rocket to and make women's division out of. But again, it was more like Alundra Blaze was the champ. These were attraction matches, and they just constantly would bring in rotating. At first, she had Luna to work with, and then Luna would bring in other girls that were really, really, really good from Japan. Bull Nakano sticking out, being the best one, and Alundra Blaze and Bull Nakano had some real kick-ass matches that were great for any era.
Yeah,
they were way ahead of their time in 1994. But again, one match is not enough. One opponent is not enough to make a whole division. You know, you get what I'm saying. So it was basically Alundra Blaze and the constant rotation of different women's wrestlers they would bring in. And trust me, a lot of them, Bull I just mentioned, Aisha Kong, also from Japan, was really, really good. Rhonda Singh, who was
Bertha Faye.
Yep, was these women were all killers in Japan.
Yeah.
And they made for some great matches. But again, if the women's division isn't being emphasized, it ain't gonna work. You know what I mean? It will just be an attraction match. What was setting it back? I don't know. Was it the federation? I don't think it certainly wasn't the women performing, because they were giving 100% at all times. Like I said, those matches were light years ahead of their time in 1994, 1995.
Yeah.
And then eventually what happens is Alundra Blaze gets frustrated, quits. Well, actually, her contract expires. She still has the belt because, of course, at this point, WWF does not care about the women's division. You know what I mean? Certainly doesn't care about establishing it other than having it be an attraction match on the card. And she brings the belt with her to WCW. And of course, that becomes the big Nitro moment where she throws it in the trash for numerous years. And you know what? That was a big shocking moment, but really, that did nothing for her career, in my opinion, because really they were trying to establish her jumping over to another brand, and all of a sudden, hey, the women's division is going to be taken seriously again. That didn't happen. They didn't get a women's division there for another year and a half.
Yeah, and so the iconic moment of her dropping the belt in the trash can was not so much emblematic of the WWF, but of women's wrestling as a whole in that moment. And going back, we had I only recently found out that in the 80s, you were bringing up like the Jumping Bomb Angels, the WWF very sporadically throughout the 80s had a women's tag team championship, and it was passed off between a very scant few teams, like you had mentioned, and that can't create or sustain a division. And so I know in the early 80s, it's passed off a couple times, and then it's just dormant until the late 80s, where I think they brought it back. It stayed with the same team for like 2 or 3 years, and then they just kind of forgot about it until Medusa, Alundra Blaze was coming around in the early 90s.
Right. And Medusa as a performer, Medusa Michelli as a performer, was light years ahead of her time, because think about it, she was not only an established women's wrestler in her own right, but also made a name for herself in Japan way before she ever hit the States. And in Japan, women's wrestling is taken so seriously. I mean, they have leagues over there. I've seen the tapes. I got tape traded in the 90s, a lot of women's wrestling that was over there, and they had probably just as many crazy matches as the men, where it was like exploding matches, women getting their heads shaved. Oh my God, just taking these horrible bumps.
Loser has their head shaved. It becomes a whole different thing in a women's match, especially going into the 80s or 90s. That is a very serious deal.
Yeah, and at times and let me tell you something. Those Japanese women, they were double tough too. And like I said, we got to see some of that in the States with Bull and Rhonda and Aisha Kong, but we did not see enough, I don't feel. WCW tried, if you remember, during the Nitro days, when they were trying to reestablish the women's belt. They would bring in Akira Hokuto.
Mhm.
They would bring in Bull Nakano once again remakes an appearance. I mean, they brought in because they had the exclusive deal with the New Japan, but they also they had deals with different Japanese promoters. So they would, in the case of Akira, she was married to Kensuke Sasaki, still is, and so that they would bring her in, and they just they. It seemed like they tried, but again, it didn't stick. Like the cruiserweight division stuck. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
in my mind, the cruiser, if they had treated women's wrestling a lot like how they did the cruiserweight division, I think we would be talking about a whole different business. And I think it wouldn't have taken so long for the women's revolution to happen
Yeah.
as it has right now, in my opinion.
Yeah. I can actually remember watching the WWF pay-per-view where Alundra Blaze came out as the women's champion and had her match with Bull Nakano. That was SummerSlam, correct?
94. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I can remember at the time as a kid thinking that there was this other like actual division within the WWF that just performed in other places or was on television stations that I couldn't get because that was a thing back there. We used to get commercials for certain restaurants and things that were not in New England. And so that was my impression back then as I was 11, 12 years old. But that was, again, just a booking decision kind of from the WWF to kind of present it that way, which I think did have good intentions, but
And
just no follow
and,
through.
and to interject and to be fair, WWF, you got to think in 1993, 4, 5, they were really, the United States was kind of burnt out on WWF at the time, and they didn't have as compelling as characters as they did back in the late 80s, early 90s. Like
Yeah.
I'm talking like 91, 92. So they would go overseas, and overseas was people forget overseas completely different market than us. And you had some fan bases that were rabid, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So I know that JJ Dillon, because I read in his book, he did co-promote a couple of shows in Japan in conjunction with different Japanese promotions, that would fill up um, the Egg Dome or the Tokyo Dome or whatever,
Yeah.
so, or Kurgan Hall. So they had a little market over there, and I know Alundra Blaze defended the women's title a couple times over there, and like I said, because she had a name in Japan previous, it was a big deal for her to go back. So
It was, and I actually think that's a good point to kind of bring up here, Stan. So we had the early 90s time of the WWF.
Yep.
For me as a kid, Alundra Blaze was, I think, the only woman wrestler that I was ever aware of. I knew who
Actually had a
Sherry was, but I didn't know that she was a trained wrestler.
Yeah. And Sherry was pretty damn good. You would have saw more of her work in AWA if you ever watch old AWA clips. And she was a damn good wrestler, double tough, and was a double tough manager as well. But her wrestling kind of got downplayed, in favor of, because she was so good at being a manager.
Yeah.
So, but Alundra Blaze, I actually had a poster of in my room. Not for the reasons you would think, but because I did respect her work quite a bit. You know what I mean? I was a fan of Medusa and WCW before that. So
Yep. I never saw Medusa at this point. It was just Alundra Blaze.
yeah. And again, that was another one of those characters. She was more of a manager in WCW, because if you remember, she managed Rick Rude for a piece. And she was the de facto manager in the Dangerous Alliance. She was like co-managing with Paulie.
Yeah.
And once in a while they would get her to wrestle, but she was primarily managing. but when she wrestled, she was badass. So I was like,
Absolutely.
she reminded me of Cynthia Reinrock. Am I pronouncing her name correct? The karate lady who was in those B movies.
I don't offhand. No, I'm sorry.
Kind of had like a short red bob. My stepdad loved her, but I've seen all her. We're talking B-rated action movies. I mean, my stepdad loved stuff like that. But yeah, she kind of had a Cynthia Reinrock vibe to her.
Cynthia Rothrock.
Rothrock, yeah. I always pronounce her name wrong, but I loved her stuff. And she was an accomplished martial artist herself. But she Medusa gave off that vibe to me when I was a kid. Not so much in look, but in spirit.
In performance.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Because she did a lot of the kicks, and you know what I mean, like just presented herself that way.
Absolutely. So the business is heading for a really big paradigm shift, maybe the biggest that's ever happened with the NWO and the WWF Attitude Era.
Yep.
And this one for me is really kind of difficult to sort through because it's really easy to look at bra and panties matches, pillow fights, barking like a dog, and just write this whole era off as a cheap play with TNA, not Test and Albert, to get young adolescent viewers to pay attention and buy merchandise. And I don't think anything that I just said is wrong, but I do think there is a more nuanced point of view for the women and this time that they are very much deserving.
And they, in the late 90s, this was and it was Attitude Era time, and it was NWO time, and it was you had your 18 to 34-year-old males that were very much tuning in. In fact, I would say even younger, because we were 15, 16 years old, tuning into this. And of course, what 15 or 16-year-old doesn't want to see TNA, you know what I mean? On top of your Stone Cold Steve Austin drinking the beer, or The Rock raising the eyebrow doing the people's elbow, or Goldberg smashing people, or Hall and Nash, whatever. But they mix that in there because that's it sold, and it all it goes back to, you had, and she wasn't a wrestler, but Sunny comes into the picture in 1995. Coincidentally enough, not too terribly long before Alundra Blaze makes her departure, Sunny comes in, right? And she was presented in just a whole different way.
Well, Sunny wasn't a trained wrestler either.
No, she wasn't. But she was basically, I've heard her being equated to the Jim Cornette of females, and they're probably about right. You know what I mean? This bitchy, I'm better than you, rich kind of character. You know what I mean? Like
that is a compliment as well.
Yeah, because Cornette at his peak was there was nobody better. And Sunny could talk a mile a minute too, because a lot of her promos were not scripted back then. So, you had 5 minutes to go out there and talk and get the point across, and she could do it. In 1996, what changes is Mark Marrow gets signed to WWF. First guaranteed contract ever, which still raises the ire of some people, Mick Foley. You know what I mean, when he tells stories to this day. But part of the clause was he wanted to bring his wife along and get his wife a look. That wife happened to be Rena Marrow, aka Sable. And I don't know what it was, but Vince McMahon saw something in her that he absolutely loved and wanted to market. And market they did. And I don't know what it was about Sable and the audience. But man, the audience took to her. Now, personally, I wasn't a humongous Sable fan when she was Sable at her peak. You know what I mean? But I understand. It's like the Goldberg thing. I wasn't a fan of Goldberg during his peak either, but I understand now, looking back, why those characters were so popular and why the public loved them so much. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? They had some charisma and appeal to them,
Yeah.
despite the fact that they were completely inexperienced at what they did.
Yeah. It doesn't mean that they couldn't draw money or that they didn't have value at all.
Right.
But
It's just something you cannot buy. And
yeah,
but it goes back to what I was saying to you, and I've constantly said this in nauseum, that pro wrestling needs those on top of guys that are like say your Barry Horowitzes, who are the guys that put other guys over. You know, you need all of that to make it work, or
yeah.
else it will not work.
It does
So,
look a little different in the women's division. One of the things that we've routinely said throughout our recording sessions is that we went into adolescence the same time the wrestling industry did as well. So
yes.
when we were teenagers still trying to struggle with our own identity, the wrestling business was as well. And I part of the reason I say this is maybe the biggest paradigm shift the wrestling business ever went through. Another thing we've talked about, we got razzed to no end for wearing wrestling shirts or for watching wrestling. Then the following year, NWO and Austin 316 shirts are all over those kids that were lambasting us the previous year. And so this era made wrestling cool in the mainstream. And the way that the women wrestlers and women in general were used and promoted, I think was a big part of that.
Yep, and they gave the people what they wanted too in mainstream popular culture. They really did. They catered more to that audience than they catered to the diehards, because let's put it on the table now. Guys like you and me will always be fans regardless of what wrestling goes through. You know what I mean? Promoters aren't worried about people like us because we're going to be here, good, bad, or indifferent, you know,
Yeah.
because we have this unconditional love for what it is to be a pro wrestling fan. They were trying to capture that mainstream audience, and you got to think this was back in the days where Seinfeld was doing monster ratings, Friends was still on. You know, they had real television to compete with, and compete they did. And
Mm-hmm.
also, and not to be underlined, was sports. You had your football, of course, which always did monster ratings, because that was back when Monday Night Football was on regular television and would do record moon landing numbers. And then you had basketball, which always a big ratings draw also. So and also too, this, you're talking the Attitude Era. This was at a time when the home run derby was or the home run record was going on between McGuire and Sosa.
Yep.
So which basically revitalized baseball. And what revitalized baseball, I may ask you? It was the use of performance enhancing drugs.
Sure does.
So, which was very prevalent in baseball in the late 90s, you know. So
And
here
at the
you have,
WWE in the early 90s.
yes, and then, well, of course the testing stopped, and coincidentally enough, guys got bigger, you know what I mean? So like people are attracted to larger than life things, is the point I'm getting at, because Friends, I just mentioned, was a larger than life comedy. Seinfeld, same thing. Wrestling was no different, and it was presented in a way where a normal person can watch it, not only easily get into it, but also not have their intelligence insulted either. So, which was a big factor into why the ratings were bananas back then.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Making it larger than life and going off of the idea that this is a competition, and moving into a Jerry Springer-esque type of programming, worked. It worked, and people like The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin were able to, I mean, not only thrive, but define the business as to what it was then and to what it would become.
yeah, and people bash on Jerry Springer, but you know what? Put yourself in the context of 1995 through 1999. in syndication, he was the biggest daytime television show on television, with the exception of Oprah, of course, which Oprah became her own thing, and now she's her own network.
Yeah.
Literally, it's called OWN. So,
One Warrior Nation.
One Warrior Nation. Do you see Warrior in the mirror? I don't. No, but
that was bad.
yeah, gosh, but it was even worse when they tried that years later in WWE. So they did that same exact thing in WWE. I'm like, really? They're rehashing this? I couldn't believe it. So, but anywho,
If it draws, it goes.
yeah, and it was a nice little callback, but I was just like, oh my god, they're really doing this. But no, but to get back to what I said about Jerry Springer, I digress. He was massive, 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 massive in the syndication field, and syndication, as you know, is seen more than cable because it's regular television, so you can literally syndicate all around the world. So Jerry Springer was a worldwide phenomenon. It wasn't just an American phenomenon; it was worldwide.
Yeah.
So.
And it's like how television was written back then too. Yeah, there were not these long overarching stories that would span across half a season, an entire season of 26 or 29 episodes. You had these episodic stories. The way that I'll get there. I know the way that I look at it was with my my darling Star Trek shows back then. Star Trek: The Next Generation was the epitome of episodic Star Trek shows, and then Deep Space Nine came out, and they started to do what is done today. I mean, they may have been the first mainline series to start doing that. They have story arcs that would travel not just 1 and 2 episodes, but I mean half the season, an entire season. And in today's streaming world, that makes a lot of sense. But back then,
Right.
You needed something that the average consumer could sit down, open up a can, watch it, be fulfilled, and just leave it.
Right, and I was about to say, now this isn't taking away from any of the main event guys that they had back then on top. They had the arcing storylines going. You know what I mean? So that fulfilled like the wrestling fan, but like all the underneath stuff was booked very much like a Jerry Springer, where Jerry Springer would have an episode where it would be like, my kid is possessed by the devil, and then the next one it's like, I have a secret to tell you. I'm secretly pregnant. You know what I mean? Like, so it was like different subjects for all the underneath guys.
Yeah.
The main guys like your Austins and your Rocks and your Takers had arcing stuff. Yeah. I felt, or on the other side, your NWO had the arcing stuff, or stuff like that. But it was catered to that audience that was used to, and dare I say, to this day, that's still a television format mode that's being played in mainstream television with the like. I always like to use NCIS or like Law and Order as good examples, where you have these characters that are established and you're familiar with, but they have different cases, or they have different murders, or they have different mysteries and different episodes, and it's just like over and over. It's anthological more than it is.
Yeah, and they're able to give birth to sister shows and franchises that can go on without end and do really well.
Which, to be fair, when you think about it, I mean, that all dates back to like the Twilight Zone. You know what I mean? Where there was different anthology. There was a different episode every Twilight Zone. You know what I mean? Different anthology episode, different arcs. There was no arcs. The arc was Rod Sterling. But anywho,
so when do we start to see the WWF Women's Championship again in late New Generation, early Attitude Era, post Alundra Blaze?
Okay, so getting back to this, because we digress quite a bit. When Sable comes in 1996 with Mark Merrow, of course, at first they try marketing her as a manager. The promoters, i.e. Vince McMahon, saw more in Sable. i.e. Vince Russo saw more in Sable. So they felt all of a sudden Sable could wrestle, even though she didn't have a lick of experience ever. So it was Luna Vachon's job to make Sable look like she actually knew what she was doing.
Yeah.
And all credit goes to Luna, because Luna
Yep.
she was one badass chick in her own right, but
Yeah.
and way ahead of her time too. But Luna was tasked. Also, they bring in Jacqueline, Miss Jackie, who are tasked with making Sable look like she sort of knows what she's doing in the ring.
The Sable Bomb.
Of course, they establish a women's division. Sable and Jacqueline trade the belt. They have their first women's champion. This was around like late '98 or so, and Sable and Jackie trade the belt over and over again. So it's still very much treated like an attraction match, because think about it, they only had Sable, they had Luna, and they had Jackie at the time. So, but then 2000 hits, 1999 hits. Then they bring in Tori, Terry Power, who wrestled previous in Glow Wrestling, I do believe. And then they bring in Ivory, who also wrestled in Glow,
Yeah.
who was Lisa Moretti in Glow. So now finally you have women that actually know what the heck they're doing, and you can see that they're trying to get it established going. Meanwhile, China was in WWF, and trust me, I am not glossing over her at all, but she was more primarily manager, and then they tried marketing her to be in with the guys more than to be in with the girls, because
And she
was,
did well.
yeah, she was convincing enough to stand toe to toe with the guys. So it's physically. So they didn't really market her at first as being like a women's champion kind of vibe. That wasn't until much later when she was on her way out. But
Well, because
yeah,
who could beat her in the women's division? I mean, if
that's what I
she's
mean. Like,
if she's winning the Intercontinental Championship and participating in Royal Rumbles,
what's the point of putting a women's belt on her?
yeah,
China was China. She was treated like the attraction that she was.
yeah,
So, and trust me, like I said, I'm not glossing over her one bit. It's just in this story, she has nothing to do with the women's division coming, you know what I mean? Like coming its way like it had, you know what I mean? Like as far as establishing a title belt and all that, and trying to establish a division again.
yeah,
Now, all credit to where credit's due. Of course, Tori doesn't work out. She's very much a flop. They try bringing her in for a WrestleMania against Sable, and those matches weren't happening. She wasn't a very good ring general, let's just say. Then you had Ivory come in summer of '99, and Ivory was much better of a wrestler. And dare I say, she was probably the most successful women's wrestler out of Glow to ever go on and become a top female star.
yeah,
But, as Ivory's career progressed, she was putting over the likes of like Miss Kitty, who
yeah,
was not very convincing, uh, and other women that were not up to her level. So when you're here and someone's here, you can only make them. It's like the Jacqueline Sable thing. You can only, and throw Luna in there. You can only make Sable look as good as you can. You know what I
yeah,
mean? So it's before she gets exposed.
yeah.
And exposed she did. So, she ended up leaving, Sable ended up leaving the company in '99 at her height and sued the company. So,
Yeah.
you know,
All right. And so we have the WWF Women's Championship.
which is still
Uh,
around. Yep.
yeah. And that gets, I don't want to say transformed or morphed into, but it has the very basic kind of gold emblem on it.
Yep.
Women's champion, and it has some red on there, and mixed in, just like with the guys division, is you have some very legit wrestlers. Ivory comes to mind for me. I thought she was always amazing. Beth Phoenix, I think was more in the Divas era, but
Yes, she was.
yeah, and Trish Stratus too. So you have your group of I don't want to say legit. Like I am trying to be very conscious and not be disrespectful to the women that were around there that helped make the division to what it is today. But at the
Right.
same time, I think it's good to be honest about what they did during this time and not to belittle their effort or who they are. But
And that is exactly why I prefaced Sable when I had talked about her, where I said I didn't see the appeal, but I saw later the appeal that she actually had and the impact that she had on the wrestling business. You know what I mean? Much akin to Goldberg, where she wasn't experienced, but she had something you just cannot buy. You know what I mean? In
yes,
the wrestling business that attracted people to her, and that was that charisma factor. You know what I
yeah,
mean? That's so hard to teach. You know what I mean? You could be the greatest women's wrestler in the world and be as legit as humanly possible, but you don't have that charisma factor.
yeah,
Forget it. You know what I mean? You're not drawing asses in the seats.
that's right.
That's just how it is.
Yep. And so around this time where we do have those type of wrestlers, there are gimmick matches for women, just like there's gimmick matches for the
Yep.
men at the time.
Yep.
Um, and this will take us through the Attitude Era into the Ruthless Aggression Era, where
Yep.
in the late 2000s, the Women's Championship gets rebranded as the Divas Championship, the little butterfly.
Oh yeah, the tramp stamp title, as it's affectionately known as. And okay, so to backtrack a little bit, post attitude, well, during the Attitude Era, when the Attitude Era was off and running and kicking on all cylinders, they signed Amy Dumas from ECW as Lita.
Mhm.
And of course, they bring her in as a manager first. They have her do a couple of moves. Lita caught on with the crowd, and Lita had the same type of charisma Sable had, except she actually knew what she was doing because she was trained in Mexico a piece, and she was doing some on the job training in ECW a little bit. So she knew how to get around the ring, and she was very much a groundbreaker. And finally, when they established her character, that's when I think the women's division broke open, and she was one of the forerunners. And it's no disrespect to anybody that came before, but when Lita came out, it was like, boom, here she is. This is literally, I mean, and literally her template can be seen in modern day. I mean, think about it. You know, women that can do some cool shit, charismatic as fuck. The hair. I mean, what woman nowadays in the women's division does not have multicolored hair?
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah.
mean?
She was a culturally edgy character and a very over and very talented and
Yeah.
was
She
able
was.
to just tick so many boxes
Oh,
at that time.
she appealed to everybody.
Yeah,
And everybody I knew who was a wrestling fan had a crush on her. And she just looked like the coolest chick ever. You know,
yeah,
she really did. And looked very much early 2000s, late 90s, you know, with the kick wears and the
yeah.
that fashion was very much in then. So she seemed very modern for, you know, a division that was kind of, you know,
Not
not very
really sure what it was at the time too.
yeah. So she comes in. Trish Stratus gets signed not too terribly long after. Now Trish again brought in as a manager, um, and then later learns how to wrestle. At first, she wasn't very good. She turned out to be one of the better performers towards the end of her career.
Absolutely.
That was a process, but she got there, and all credit to her. And you know, Trish gets signed. Meanwhile, over in the WCW side of things, which WCW was going under a little bit, they had you know, your Stacy Keeblers and your Tori Wilsons, and you know, your others. They were trying to make the Nitro Girls wrestle, you know, and that was Vince Russo play.
Yep.
And Finley trained a lot of these girls, and some stuck, some didn't. You
Yeah.
know, but Fit, to his credit, had more success with the early 2000s women's wrestling. Uh, Nora, who would become Molly Holly, was one of the shining stars in that whole division,
She sure was.
coming from WCW. And when she gets signed with WWE, she also, because the great women need somebody else to work with, and Molly was very, very, very good in the ring. Victoria gets signed not too long after. Kim gets signed not too long after. So, and finally, we're and Tori and Stacy get brought over from the sale. So, Stacy didn't wrestle that much, but Tori wrestled a little bit more. But they were still like manager kind of, valets. Um,
It was a
but
transitional division.
right. And my point being is that during the Ruthless era, they had the right idea finally. And I thought for a minute that they were going to get the women's division established. Jazz comes in also from ECW. That's very important. Jackie's still on the roster. Terry Runnels, well, again, they transitioned her off. She wasn't really a wrestler to begin with. She was more of a interviewer / valet to whoever.
She had her own stable. She was a very a very accomplished manager.
Right.
Or maybe I think more in WCW than WWF, but yeah.
Right, with the York Foundation. So, and then later with PMS with with Ryan Shamrock and Jacqueline. Ryan Shamrock didn't wrestle that much either. She was more just brought in as a valet. But what I'm saying is the early 2000s, once Lita comes into the picture, it just seemed like they just started signing people. And when the women's division was kind of starting to get off and running, I thought it was going to go in a good direction. But by 2004, you had a lot of frustrated divas. I mean, I've heard the story that Molly Holly, she wanted to be on WrestleMania. They had nothing for her. And she said, okay, I'll shave my head. Will that get me on WrestleMania? Sure. So, she had the legit shave her head to get on WrestleMania. So how funny is that? Now you have women headlining WrestleMania. So
yep. And she's one of those people that stands out during this time in the women's division that I think was way ahead of her time and would probably have had more success during our current era of women's wrestling, but was still able to was a legit pioneer. Right? I know like words like that get kind of thrown around, but she was absolutely in that group that made the women's division today possible.
Oh, she was. And and this of course transitions because by 2004, 2005, you had a lot of, and even by 2006, the women's division was still there, but you literally had a division that was 2005, Mickey James comes in also, which that was desperately needed because Trish Stratus needed somebody good to work with, and Mickey James filled that void, and she was fantastic. She still is fantastic in the ring.
Yeah.
Now, but by 2006, 5, 6, the women's division starts to wind down again. A lot of divas leave out of frustration. You know what I mean? That divas division leaves. They go to other places. Gail Kim moves to TNA, and of course, it starts establishing the Knockouts division over there with Awesome Kong. A couple of years later, other women just either get out of the business completely or retire or go to different promotions or whatever. But of course, then it leaves two. Then it leaves Trish Stratus and Lita being the top dogs, and then Mickey James right underneath and Victoria underneath. So but eventually Mickey James and Victoria leave because they hung on as long as they could, and they just weren't doing anything, and a lot longer than people gave them credit for. Molly Holly, she kind of drifted in the background. She left eventually, but you don't get an establishment again until the Divas division comes along. They rebrand the women's title into the Divas title, and this was still very much, what was this, 2007, 2008. So you had women on the roster, but again, it was back to the way it was. It was treated as a bathroom match, sadly,
Yeah,
popcorn match, attraction match, on panties matches in some instances, and it just yeah, it just
it's
seemed
not a
like
good look even today.
yeah, and it just seemed like it went backwards. You have women that were just hanging on, trying, but the women that really wanted to try left.
Yep.
So
Yep. And so around here, like you had said, the TNA knockouts division gets established. We in the WWE, we are seeing the first few years of the brand extension. And
yep,
so for a little while, you have the WWE Women's Championship, and then you have the Divas Women's Championship, and they
yep,
are uh, sister titles to each other for a little while.
yep. And eventually they get merged into one. So
Yep. And then yeah, the Divas title would be the last iteration of these types of championships for women before the WWE officially establishes a uh, solid women's division along with the brand extension, and we start to see titles get redefined, which I nerd out over a lot. But
oh yeah.
yeah, to where we have a Raw and SmackDown women's championship. What was the what are the final days of the Divas and women's division as they were being merged look like, and what did it look like as like I think Charlotte Flair was the last Divas champion, and so she was already there,
Yep.
um, getting help getting things off the ground for the women's division as we know it.
Yep. And to quickly mention, TNA's knockout division was happening. This was around 2007, 2008 time period. And this is where they were bringing in Angelina Love, Velvet Sky, Awesome Kong, what was it? Hamada was in there. Taylor Wilde was in there. So you had all these solid women's wrestlers. Gail Kim being the forerunner with Awesome Kong. They had just had some kick ass matches, and those matches were great. And I wish they would get mentioned more because they were just hard hitting and they held up and they were fantastic.
Yeah,
I can't say enough about them. But TNA actually had the hot hand on what the women's division would look like currently back in 2007, 2008. But because it was TNA and because it was the second brand, you know, we saw it. Mainstream did not see it. So
yeah,
it was a big dichotomy there.
yeah,
The end days. Now, you bring in Beth Phoenix, who was just a phenomenal, very much up there with China, except I think unlike China, she actually had true wrestling skill to her because she wrestled in high school.
yeah,
She wrestled in college. She was an amateur. So she knew how to take care of herself in the ring and knew what she was doing movement wise. And she was a fan. So still's a fan. So you had her trying her best and of course they divaed it up by calling her the Glamazon,
yeah,
because everything has to be divaed up. But they bring her in. Natalia comes in, and Natalia, who's still on the roster today, was one of the. I mean, look at the pedigree. I mean, need I say more about her? But
yep,
she's as bad can come, and gets a lot of shit. But quite honestly, I think she's consistently been one of the best wrestlers in, I would say, the last 12 years.
yeah,
Easy.
yeah. Like I think her and most notably, I think Charlotte Flair. Yeah, they have the pedigree, like you said, but I believe both of them have very much so established themselves well beyond their name and what their family had done in the business.
Right, because in WWF lore, Jim Neidhart was just a tag champ and nothing more. You know what I mean? I dare I say Natalia has established herself way more than her father ever did.
I
Same with
completely agree.
Charlotte.
Yeah,
Way more. Like we're talking like beyond levels where you can establish one from the other, you
yeah,
know. So but you had, and then of course comes in other women's wrestlers such as AJ Lee, who comes in, and not the biggest woman in the bunch, but
No,
had
very
that
tiny.
very tiny, but was a fan, had a lot of heart, and charisma out the wazoo. She had that Lita type charisma, and she was a Lita fan when she was a little girl, as it was established in multiple videos. She just had that appeal with the audience, and she was the hottest women's wrestling thing for quite a while. And was a very over character. Caitlyn was in, and
Yeah,
Caitlyn, of course, she had the body, and she was decent, but she wasn't like, I wouldn't say she was. They tried making her on the level of AJ, and just nobody could be AJ. It's just she had that charisma factor that nobody could put their finger on.
yeah.
So
When do we start to see Total Divas start being, it was on part of the WWE network for $9.99 a
yep,
month.
yep,
Like that was brilliant how they instituted that. Like every time Stephanie and Triple H got in the ring, but
almost like a Mick Foley shout out,
yeah,
9.99.
yeah. But now we're starting to see reality television to become part of the WWE product, and to all of his credit, The Miz was the only person who went the reality television route and ended up in the WWE. Very, very. He was disparaged quite a bit by the reality TV community, and so
Yeah.
I like good for him for being
What
able to come in and do what he's done.
but in Mrs. Roots, if you ever listen to his story, he was a wrestling fan first and foremost. So,
Yep.
there's a reason the cream rose to the top, as they say, and he's right now he's one of the best guys on the roster, regardless of what you give him,
Yeah.
promo wise, and he's just always consistent.
Yeah.
But going back to Total Divas, now Brie and Nikki come in during this time where it was, the 2007, 2008 time period where the Divas division was still very much a thing. And of course, they have the twin thing going on, so of course that's very appealing to fans. I'm sure Brie and Nikki cannot, basically tell you anything about, like, Lou Thesz or Frank Gotch or anything like that. You know what I mean? And why should they? They got hired based on the fact that they're twins and they're very appealing looking too, very exotic looking.
And they are really talented with their charisma. Lots of
Right.
interviews I've seen with them, they really take to that that spot in the business and in the product. I think did really well.
Yep, but in saying that, they listened and they learned from others that were um, more experienced on the in the division than they were, and they took that, and in all fairness, they became stars themselves and very decent in the ring because of that, and dare I say more than decent, and they were the forerunners, and you have this Total Divas show that comes up. Of course, they're executive producers of Total Divas, so they're going to be featured the most. And Total Divas was more of a vehicle of getting Eva Marie, who was very much a reality star and had no pro wrestling experience whatsoever. And also, you had, was it JoJo, who's Bray Wyatt's soon-to-be wife, if not his wife already. So,
Yeah.
You had, and JoJo did not work out. She became a ring announcer and then eventually quit the business, and and became a mom. But they were trying to establish those two characters in the reality show,
Yeah.
and of course, with Nikki and Bree being pegged as, we've been on the roster for X amount, and these are this is the story, and then these are the other characters that are unfolding. See Natalia, see all these revolving door of characters. Naomi comes to mind, and Naomi she was another one from the late 2000s era that really she was a much better athlete than most.
Yeah.
And
Oh, and even I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh no, and she caught on quick, and also married to one of the Usos. I mean, she very much. I would imagine pro wrestling's being talked about in that household quite a bit. So
Yeah,
because
especially
the Samoan dynasty, I mean, they are wrestling. So
yeah, marrying into that family, you have so many different generations to talk about.
and like I've said in nauseum, there is not one Samoan wrestler that can't work. Every Samoan wrestler can. So
Yep. I have a Halo buddy who grew up in Parma, Ohio, which is where the Miz is really from, who
yep.
went to high school with him. I remember just talking about Halo or talking about wrestling one day when I was playing Halo. He didn't really care. He's not a wrestling fan. He said that him and the Miz were not friends or anything, but he did. He was, I think, 1 year ahead of him. So, that's interesting. For me to be able to chat with him. So we have Total Divas. The women's division is being morphed into something else. And I've got just a few more points that I was hoping you could bring us up on before we can start to tie everything together. And so
Yep.
we have Total Divas. When do we start to see NXT to come into the picture?
Now, okay, so to rewind back, they had Florida Championship Wrestling, and
Yes.
a lot of guys and girls started in Florida Championship Wrestling, run by Steve Kern. Dusty Rhodes had a little hand in it also, because of course Dusty and Steve Kern, the Florida thing.
Yeah.
And finally, Vince, this was around like 2011, 2012 time period. Triple H was kind of winding down his in-ring career full time, and Vince gave him NXT to basically run. And in cooperation with the guys he had in place, William Regal, Dusty Rhodes, Norman Smiley, Bill DeMont, and really, 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 and also Sarah Del Rey, who is very much responsible for training a lot of the women's division wrestlers we see today that are very solid in the ring. But all the guys and girl I just mentioned are all instrumental in getting that ball rolling on let's really make this a division. Oh, of course, Fit Finley's involved too, because Fit, even back in the early 2000s, he was in mid 2000s, he was trying to establish good fundamentals in the ring with the women, and Fit never gets talked about when it comes to his contributions to women's wrestling, but Fit really, really, really wanted to establish the division and make it a serious thing, and have these women that knew, what they were doing, how to carry a match, and really get the people involved, and also have some good fundamentals.
From my understanding, him and Dusty as well. Like I know Dusty was a really huge part in the early days of NXT. But from what I understand, Finley and Dusty were the guys that were helping the women kind of get wise to the business in the early days of NXT.
Yes, and it was more Dusty being Dusty. Dusty was the creative guy, coming up with the ideas for all the different women. You know what I mean? And Fit was more of the guy that did all the ring work. Which suited Fit fine because Fit liked to train wrestlers, so and make the business kind of go on. He like I said, there's a reason they've released him and brought him back so many times, because Fit does have something to offer backstage within the promotion, and the women's division was no different. So, yeah, very much. And Dusty came up with like I had said in a previous episode, Dusty was the one who came up with Paige's idea for a gimmick, because Paige wanted to go as, she wanted to change her gimmick completely as like a blonde, just like anybody else. Dusty's like, nah, Dusty must have just seen the girl with the dragon tattoo and's like, nah, you're my girl with the dragon tattoo, like keep the black hair and you're Paige, like
Yeah.
kind of thing, like same thing Dusty did in the 80s with NWA and early 90s with WCW, where he came up with these oddball ideas. Some of them worked great, some of them didn't work so great, but the ones that worked great were awesome.
And so around this time, we the WWE company in itself is starting to do things different, because we have a lot of the indie promotions like TNA, Impact, Global Force, whatever was going on in that melting pot there. But like Ring of Honor and things like that. And so NXT starts off as like a game show, like The Price is Right for for the guys, but it's going to start to become the developmental territory that takes the place of OVW and Florida Championship Wrestling. And so we start to see the NXT Women's Championship. And I did pull up here to make sure that I have my facts straight. It says Paige was the inaugural champion in 2013.
Yep.
And going on from here, there's still the brand split: SmackDown, Raw, and then now NXT. When does this boil over to the women getting their own legitimate division? We're going to see talks of them getting their own pay-per-view. They're going to main event WrestleMania, have their own elimination chamber, have their own Royal Rumble. Around this time, how are things starting to come together for the women in the WWE product?
Well, two things. Now, where Total Divas gets a lot of shit for being a reality show, right? You couldn't deny the ratings. It was one of the highest ratings on E, and WWE saw that. So, of course, and they've already had this NXT division in place where they were training the next bunch of guys and girls to, come up on the main roster. Meanwhile, they had their own division, which were heavily featured on E to work with. And, but minus that, AJ Lee, who did not appear on Total Divas at all, maybe in like a small cameo or clip here and there, you know what I mean? But she was never a featured performer on Total Divas ever. Yeah. AJ Lee comes about, and she, like I said, she breaks the modern women's division wide open because of her appeal. And due to a tweet that Stephanie McMahon puts out about, women being equal in the business, you know what I mean? Like, I think she was just talking in general business, because Stephanie McMahon is very high up in WWE. So AJ Lee takes exception to this tweet and tweets her own thing where, the whole give divas a chance thing, so that sort of created a groundswell. And of course, at the same time, the fans really took to AJ Lee's character. So you have AJ Lee here. They make her the women's champion, or the Divas champion at the time, I should say there. Mm-hmm. And she's working with all the divas that you see on the Total Divas show, left and right. Up comes Paige from NXT. She was the NXT World Champion. She loses it. She comes up, and here she is all of a sudden. Paige comes in, and it was like her and AJ, it was like the modern women's division was broken wide open with those two.
Yeah.
And finally, you have with Paige somebody who not only comes from a wrestling family, somebody who's not only very attractive and charismatic, but also somebody who is young on the roster and can go in the ring. So you have that going for her, and she comes up, and man, does she get over big with everybody in the crowd, male, female, old, young. It was like, here's AJ Lee, who you had a massive appeal, but here's Paige, and you're like, you know,
Yeah,
and
AJ kind of became uh, yesterday's news, and I thought
it,
like they would start to incorporate that with her and Paige really well going forward.
right, and the fact that they were good friends in real life helped, with them working together. But here finally you have not just another match on the card, you have a match that the fans are invested in, is my point, and people want to see, because both women are that good. So here we go. And other all the total divas start playing off that. Nikki and Brie become great performers in their own right. Naomi becomes a great performer in her own right. Meanwhile, in NXT, you have more women being signed to deals. You have your Charlottes, your Becky, Sasha, Nia Jax, um, uh, Bailey's. You have all these women at the same time who were just being trained a year prior, now establishing themselves on NXT, and it's just a groundswell. And it's all of a sudden it was just fixing the burst. You
Yeah,
know what I mean? And the following year, when Stephanie McMahon, it was either a year or 2 years, Stephanie McMahon finally not only introduces the women's title belt, but also brings up the women, that are basically dominating the roster right now. Uh, Bailey, Becky, Charlotte,
Charlotte. Yeah,
yeah, and Sasha. She brings those four up to the roster to, and meanwhile they the divas division, which is now the women's division, is just being established left and right, and you just have this groundswell of something happening. And then all of a sudden, because all these women that are now coming up, and all the women that continue to come up from NXT are just primed and ready to go, all of a sudden they're main eventing Hell in the Cell. All of a sudden they're main eventing WrestleMania. All of a sudden you have storylines that people are invested in. It's just it was like the floodgates open.
yeah. All right. So Stephanie is putting together a lot of big announcements for the women and the women's division in the WWE. When do we start to see 50, maybe not 50-50, but full rosters of men and women across the three different brands?
By I would say by the 2015 to the 2017 time period is where you really see an abundance of the NXT influence, because once the four women above mentioned came in, then it just like the floodgates opened, the ground swelled, and then they just kept bringing up more and bringing up more and bringing up more. And all these women had something to them, and you had finally it was to a point to where, hey, they can headline pay-per-views, because they were that good in the ring, they're because at times they were better than the men. They really were. And you had and I gotta believe in their minds too. They had that chip on their shoulder, like, hey, we can do this. You know what I mean? What's stopping us?
Yeah,
Really.
yeah. And I've noticed personally, like going back to the ruthless aggression era, you had some women who could put on, they were very talented. They were trained wrestlers, where
Yep.
there were a lot of women back then who were still part of the product, but weren't trained to go on there into the ring. It all of their matches were usually pretty short. Even the maybe like the women's title matches between the more trained and more legit brawlers were always pretty short. But even looking at them back then, like Beth Phoenix and Ivory, compared to the women's division now, the women seem to wrestle differently now than they did back then. And what I mean by that is that the it seemed like a lot of times back then the women were maybe trying to mimic some of the styles of the men, but because they are all physically smaller, the ring in some instances becomes a hindrance to that kind of style. And the women
Right.
today seem to work more comfortably in the full size ring than they did years ago. Do you see anything like that on your end?
Yeah, because well, oh, yeah, and think about it too. In WWF rings, especially back then, they were the hard rings still. They had all the rings that were, prevalent in the '80s that they had for your King Kong Bundys and Andres and Big John Studs and all that stuff. They were still there. So imagine a woman taking a bump on that if the men complained that those rings were just brutal. Imagine a
Yeah,
woman's body on that. I mean, so there was a reason they worked the way they worked back then, and plus they were trained to work smarter, not harder back then. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Whereas the women now, I mean, you think about it too. The women they have on the roster now come from different athletic backgrounds, so they're used to physically taking it. You know what I mean? Whereas they're not primarily just trained to be a wrestler, and maybe they did something else beforehand, maybe not. But you look at a person like Charlotte, who was a trained gymnast and also played uh, varsity volleyball. Yeah,
she's a
you
trained
look
athlete through and through.
right, and you had you have others on the roster too that just come from these different backgrounds, whether it be uh athletics, fitness, whatever, you know what I mean? Like they are as badass of athletes as you could be, but they're in a WWE ring. So,
Yeah,
they can physically take that pain, and keep going. They're trained to do so when they're down in the NXT rings, so one of the big advantages of having that performance center now.
yeah.
So, yeah.
When do so they establish women's championships uh, in all three brands,
Yep.
and with the network logo being prominently displayed on what would eventually be all of the major singles titles except for the United States and
Yep.
Intercontinental. Um, Part of me kind of cringes at that. It is kind of just like a corporate logo branding, but in the sense of what we're talking about today, it's also, hey, this is women's wrestling and a predominantly male uh, sport, but that division, their champions and their performance is viewed pretty equally alongside the men's division. And so for all of my kind of hemming and hawing about the network logo belts that they've made, I did like that the women's championships were put out there right next to the men's, and it's like, hey, this is the women's division, but these are no longer popcorn matches.
No. And yeah, you had um in 2018, I think it was, you had the Evolution pay-per-view, which was all women. And to have that kind of roster to to just headline a whole pay-per-view. I mean, it was a one and done thing. They haven't done it since, but they didn't leave it to the point to where they couldn't do something like that again, because they can. They still can. Now, in the meantime, you have not too terribly long after that, or right before that, or whatever, you have Becky Lynch takes off, and we talk about money drawing women money drawing personalities in pro wrestling, akin to Sable, akin to Alita. Um, Here we are. You have Becky Lynch coming out there, badass women's wrestler in her own right. She had training early on, but when you put her next to Bailey, Charlotte, and Sasha, which one of these things is not like the other? Because maybe she doesn't show it. Maybe, you know what I mean? Maybe the personality is over more than the actual ring work. I don't know. But there was something about Becky that the fans just really got behind, and that whole man thing just took off. And that was the biggest thing. And that was what headlined WrestleMania. So, and dare I say that was the match that stole the show that year. So
yeah. Well, I know this year, I think the Royal Rumble card was I loved everything up until the men's Rumble. I thought the men's Rumble was really poorly put together. Poor Kofi Kingston. Like he's done so, like his Rumble moments are legendary, and I can
just proves that he's human, just like everyone else. You know what I mean? For every cool move he can execute, there is a botch here and there. And all wrestlers are immune to it, or not immune to it. You can, you know what I mean? Go back to some of even the greatest performers in pro wrestling.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think the reason that stuck out the most for me was up until then, I thought the Rumble was I just wasn't into it for whatever reason. And I remember I was watching that with Tim. We were texting, but we were watching it together. Yep. And when Kofi came out, I'm like, finally, something interesting is going to happen. And then, poof, I'm like, oh, that's rough. But I think that is a great example of where the women's division can shine. And they're not dependent on the men's division anymore. They have their own matches, their own storylines. And that was where I watched this. I'm like, yeah, the women kicked butt tonight. They performed, and the men absolutely did not, in my opinion.
Yeah, and a lot of it had to do with the talent, the performers that they had in the women's match, both in the surprise entrance and in the current roster that they have available to them now. Yeah. So,
all right, I didn't mean to jump ahead.
No. You could jump all over the place. We could do what we want.
That's right. So. The Evolution pay-per-view sticks out. I wasn't watching regularly when the championships were kind of christened to what they are today, where you have a consistent and very talented women's division. Yep. I did watch when the women's tag team championship was reintroduced, if I'm being faithful to it. Like, I didn't even know until a few weeks ago that the WWF had a women's tag team championships back in the 80s. But yeah. I remember watching the Boston Hug Connection win those titles. And we've both got to participate in events that are historically significant, and I can remember watching this, and I'm like, this is a really big moment in women's wrestling, in WWE history at all. And there was a lot of emotion from the women in the ring afterwards. I'm like, that's really cool. And then they would introduce the NXT tag team the women's tag team championships. And just because those titles are not being used the way that I think they have the potential to be is not a commentary on the women who hold them. It's the WWE's consistent history of not knowing what to do with the tag team division in the last 25 years.
Right. And that goes back. You can even look at the men's tag team division, as we discussed at length. It's weird. The emphasis on the tag team division, whether it's male or female, is not emphasized quite enough. And I don't know what it is. It's like every other promotion but WWFE, with a few bright spots here and there, you know?
Well, and we had our tag team episode, and I think I've actually given a lot of thought to this, and so let me sidetrack us for a minute. I think the change that took place mostly in the Attitude Era, to where the belts no longer mean you are the best at what they do. Storylines are now predominantly used, and the belts are just props. But if there isn't anyone striving for the title because it means that you are the best at what you do, especially in the tag team division, there's nothing else you can do at that point with those championships. If they, and if the crowd is in on it, the crowd got smart to got wise to the business. If those belts don't mean that you're the best at something, you can't do much else. You would have to create really intricate storylines, which they do, but not really well with tag teams. And I don't think that we'll ever be able to see the second coming of tag team wrestling in the WWE, as long as that is how the belts are portrayed in use, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail right on the head. And again, it's that start-stop thing, or they're hot on it 1 minute and then nothing the next. It's a shame that the tag team division in both leagues, in both iterations, whether it's male or female, gets treated like that. And I wish, because it's not like they have a lack of women on the roster. You know what I mean? They very much have a lot of women that they could easily make, not only tag team champions, but also have a division that where people can be invested in.
Yeah.
But it's all too, it's rooted on the wrestler as well, because what if that particular guy or girl has aspirations to go on and be a single star? Not everyone thinks in the terms of the Legion of Doom or the Dudleys. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where we want to be a tag team for the rest of our life. This is what we do, and that's it.
And in those situations, the titles represent you are the best at what you do in this division.
Yep.
And the belts just don't mean that anymore. And so I remember watching the introduction of the WWE Women's Tag Team Championships. And then I saw that they were on, they had a separate championship for NXT.
Yep.
And I think that's great. It's awesome that the women have this type of representation. That's not my issue with it. It's, you don't know what to do without the titles. Like, as a business, they don't. And so I was just kind of confused. Like, what are you going to do? Like Shinsuke Nakamura, the former Intercontinental Champion, rather.
Yep.
Went 4 months without defending the Intercontinental Championship last year.
Yeah, which, what happened to the 30-day clause?
I know that was a big storyline for Shawn Michaels way back in the day.
Yeah, 30-day clause / suspension, and then he turns it around and there he was in that ladder match, and yeah, just did a complete 180 on that whole thing.
Yeah.
So
In my cynical, jaded attitude era, Mark, in my
yeah,
mind, when I look at the women's tag team championships and how they don't mean a whole lot, again, nothing to do with the women, I'm like, now they really are on the level with the men's division. Because they got a bunch of tag team championships that don't mean anything and they don't know what to do with them. Congratulations, you've made it.
yeah.
All right. All right. So taking a look at the last couple years,
Yep.
whenever the women have their own Royal Rumble match, their own Elimination Chamber, they have been the headline at WrestleMania.
Mhm.
The women's championship has been the main event.
Yep.
Are we really at that point now where the women's division is established? I thoroughly enjoy watching women's wrestling today for much different reasons than I did when I was a teenager.
Yes. To answer in a quick form, yes, because they're not just part of the show anymore. Now they have all their own storylines. Now they have
Merchandise.
they have merchandise. They're treated on, if not an equal level, more so, and heavily featured, and rightfully so, because they all can go, and it's not a here's the men's and then here's the popcorn match. No, you don't have that anymore. Now you have people really willing to sit there and really willing to invest into women's wrestling now.
Yeah.
So,
Like I said, the Royal Rumble this year, the women's Royal Rumble performed much better than the men's did. And
yep.
now, if I'm just popping on to the WWE Network part of Peacock, or going to the WWE's YouTube channel, where they release previous matches that were pay-per-view, is just like a freebie on there. Now it's like, okay, let me take a look at the women's match from Mania, or the women's Elimination Chamber, or the women's Rumble. There is no bias in my preference for searching through those matches.
Yeah.
With that in mind, let me reel in my my little tangent there. With that in mind, what is there anything that needs to happen now for the division, or is it you've done it, you're here, now let's enjoy it and work to make it good?
I don't think now they're at a point where they're doing a start stop thing anymore. That's long gone. They don't start and stop anything. You're on that main roster, it's because you're really good. It's not because you're whatever. It's because the company sees something in you that they want. They see more in you than you want to.
Yep.
Good, bad, or indifferent. They see it, and there is no shortage of right now, and the proof is in the pudding. They keep just bringing women up, and in all forms or fashion. I mean, Rhea Ripley's a new one that sticks out. That is not only has the skills, has the charisma, but can go in the ring. Great. You had Raquel Diaz just makes her slash Raquel Gonzalez makes her roster debut recently. You have on the AEW side, you have Britt Baker, you have Ruby Soho, who was in WWE previous and requested a release to go to AEW.
Ruby Riot.
Yeah, Ruby Riot, and you have women that are they're featured on television because they're good. It's not because they're women. It's not because they're beautiful looking. which they very much are in both cases. But it's because they're good enough to be there. You know, Charlotte being the forerunner, whether people like it or not, she's a controversial figure when talking about it in groups. She shouldn't be, but she is. And Charlotte being the top dog in that business of pro wrestling right now. Man, there's nobody like her.
Yeah.
Sonya Deville playing a great heel character. I like her work. I have always liked her work. Sasha still hanging in there. Natalia still hanging in there, you know, and man,
Yeah.
Beth Phoenix coming in and out of retirement every once in a while. How about that? You know, I could throw her in there too.
Yeah.
You know, but it's now it's people have a different set of eyes when watching now. It's not the Attitude Era fans anymore. It's people actually willing to take a look because in society it's just completely different.
Yeah.
And you know, women's wrestling is no different than how we look at women in today's society because
Yeah.
here we are, you know, leaders in the industry, leaders in life even. So, and are on not only an equal playing field with the men, but surpass the men in a lot of cases. So, you know, I'm happy to see that.
Yep. Me as well. Excuse me. So to kind of put a bow on this, excuse me. If you have time to watch the current product, or maybe back when there was a time where you were able to keep up with the current product, aside from the women that you just listed,
Yep.
who are standouts for being significant, is there anything that you have seen in the women's division that has kind of stuck out and been like, wow, this is great?
Um, man, you know, I'll be honest with you. There's not a match I don't watch where I think, man, this is awesome. I love the what was it? I like any time that Ronda Rousey's on television, because she's such a polarizing figure.
Yeah.
To put the John Cena label on her, but she really is, like, because you know, people don't know how to take the Ronda, but you know, I've always appreciated her work in UFC and what she brought to the table there, and I like the stuff that she's doing in WWE. Do I wish she was more of that badass Ronda heel that I saw in the UFC? Yes. I understand why she isn't, because, you know, they're trying to sell her to a different market. You know what I mean? So it's
Well, and
uh,
that's also kind of Charlotte's gig at the moment as well.
right, right. It's like, you know, but I think there's definitely room for a badass Ronda Rousey on the roster. You know,
For
and
sure.
you know, that I would love to see down the line. Um, anytime anytime Charlotte's in the ring, it's like watching AJ Styles in the ring. I never have to worry about whether it's going to be a bad match or not. I just
Yeah.
wonder what cool stuff I'm going to see during the match. You know what I mean? And how invested I'm going to be watching it. I love I've always been a big fan of Naomi's work too.
Yeah.
Uh, I've also always been a big fan of Natalia. I always like to keep tabs on her. Natalia is one of those. She makes the best out of what she's given, no matter
Yeah.
where she is on the roster. So, you know, do I wish Natalia can do more on the roster? Yeah, but you know, I understand why she isn't, because she is so good that she's,
Yeah.
you know, they're trying to make the next generation of guy or girls, I should say.
Yeah.
And
I have seen that happening quite a bit lately. AJ Styles helping to put over. I mean, Omos.
yeah, who knew
Edge.
AJ would be the grizzled veteran? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I still have the Polaroid that I got with him when you took me to that TNA
Yeah.
convention, and like he
Yep.
was the TNA tag team champion, and so I said, "They're going to get a picture." He said, "Yeah," and I'm like, "Can I hold this?" He's like, "Yeah, go ahead." And I remember, I mean, it had to have weighed 17, 18 pounds. I was like, I had the Figures Inc. titles at that time, but I was really surprised at how heavy that was. But yeah, he's one of the grizzled veterans. He's helping to establish and put over the new guys.
Yeah, and like same with the Miz. Miz is kind of like in a Natalia spot too, where he's making more of the roster. He's still keeping his name out there, but he's more, if you notice, making the roster of the next guys coming
Yeah.
along. You know what I mean? So it's with the Miz, it's the same thing. Now he's the grizzled veteran, you know. So
And
putting
Edge
over
is
the young
working with
guy.
Damian Priest as well.
Yeah. So you Edge and Damian Priest, yes. Um, so
The new brood.
it's yeah, the new brood. But those are just good examples right there. But as far as women's matches, getting back to that because we're veering off again, uh, any single time I could, it, I to I hate to generalize it, but it's so true because there's so many good talents
Yeah.
on TNA, now Impact, AEW, and WWE, and also NXT 2.0. If you ever get a chance to catch any clips of that,
Yeah.
there's so many good women that you can literally pop on a match now, and you can sit there, and it's just like watching anything else. It would be like watching, say you're Billy Gunn versus somebody, or
Yeah.
Hardcore Holly versus somebody. Like it's something you're invested in. Is my point,
Yeah.
and I hate to put it like that, but but that's my mindset. That's the way it is. If I get a clip of it sent to me, I'm gonna watch it. So it's
Yeah.
um, and
Yeah.
and and it's so cool that it's become that. And it just speaks of that the wrestling fans can be trained to love something like this. And I wish more people who hadn't watched since the Attitude Era have more of an open mind for these sort of things.
Yeah. I think the women's division is just now a regular part of the product. They're not an attraction like they were in like the 90s. They're
It's part of what makes the engine run,
yeah.
like just like how I said you needed a Barry Horowitz to a Shawn Michaels, you need you always need a bunch of these guys to work, or Hulk Hogan on top, you just need, in my opinion, now it's to a point where they need the women to make the whole show work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. They are they're part of that. They're part of their show. They are a big part of that product,
You
and
take them out of it, it's a big void, you
yeah,
know?
yeah, putting on a WWE show or watching a WWE event, if they weren't there, like you just said, there would be a big gaping hole. Like the product would
Yeah.
not be complete without them.
Yes, and it's not like the days of previous where you had a women's division 1 minute and then you didn't, and nobody really cared or noticed.
Yeah,
Now it's to the point where, hey, if they're not on the show, the crowd's going to be disappointed. So
exactly.
yeah,
Um, who would be uh, some of your all-time favorite women to uh, to watch?
My all-time favorite. Okay, so in history of women's wrestling to watch, probably I would have to say Medusa would be one. I would have to say Charlotte currently, of course.
Yeah,
Uh, I loved Awesome Kong when she was up and
yeah,
running. She was one of my all-time. She reminded me of like the Vader of women,
yeah.
basically. I loved her work. I still love her work to this day. Uh, Trying to think of who else. Molly Holly, always loved her. There's so many women on the roster that or there's so many women over the years that I've appreciated, but
Yeah,
those are the ones that just stick out the most to me.
yeah. I I did like Awesome Kong when she was a big part of TNA back in the day. When I started getting back into being a regular wrestling fan last year, um, I loved Nia Jax. Like in the Women's Royal Rumble, they would have that spot that was usually given to the Big Show where they're all over there and he just stands up and blows everyone off him. And I've seen that spot done with her too.
I
And
call it the King of the Mountain spot, basically.
yeah, yeah,
Like you're a kid on the schoolyard and the biggest kid's playing King of the Mountain kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
I loved watching her perform. Her and Baszler were, I mean,
Shayna Baszler, yeah.
yeah, we're just such. And Baszler was an MMA fighter as well, very
Yep.
very legit woman. And so and
Yeah.
Ronda
I'm
Rousey.
glad you I'm glad you brought up Nia because I always loved her work, and you know, if there was ever a second coming of Awesome Kong, she would be it. As far as, you know, just being this big brute kind of woman, you know what I mean? But like believability is so, you know what I mean? Who's gonna beat somebody like that?
Yeah,
It's very hard to come by. So to interject that real quick.
yeah.
So
No, I think that's yeah, very very poignant. Um, I think for me, I definitely didn't have as much appreciation for the women's division as a kid that I do now. Um, Even in the Diva era, I was I've never dug the reality show kind of atmosphere um, anywhere, but especially uh, in wrestling. I love being able to watch it now. I think Bianca Belair is incredible. I think she is really well placed right now as
oh,
the Raw Women's Champion.
and again, a woman who comes from such a strong athletic background, and man, how can I forget her? In recent times, she is over like nobody's business right now,
Yeah.
and man, is she good.
Yep.
She's very deceptive because she's a very tiny woman and slender, but man, she's as badass as any of them. So
Yeah. And not that long ago, I think it was her and Dewdrop, where she had Dewdrop up on her shoulders. And like it took just a minute for her to get him up there, but it reminded me very much of someone trying to get Vader or the Big Show up there, and like that was a really I think it was kind of a risky spot to do, but she pulled it off, and that's incredible. I think she's very talented. Charlotte, I mean, I'm already one of the greatest of all time. I enjoy watching Becky. Becky has a lot of charisma, um, and she's kind of juggled her gimmick around too. And so to be able to do that and still entertain and come up with that. Asuka
yeah,
returned recently.
and Asuka is a nice throwback to you know, the women wrestling that I first saw in the '90s, where it was via tape trade, was the all Japanese women's league, and I know how badass those women can be. So she's a throwback to me of that kin of women's wrestlers, which I like. I like a
Is
lot.
that still around today, like an all women's promotion?
Um, not sure. I don't think so. But Japan is it's a different business than the United States. There's really only two sports over there. There's wrestling and baseball, and both of
Yeah.
them are equally as big, and they get coverage in the newspapers or whatever. It may be around in a smaller form, but not to the level it was back in the 90s.
Yeah, because it's no longer a niche uh, market. You can find
no, and all those
quality
women,
women in every promotion.
no, all those women were trained in the same dojos as all the men over there and were equally as tough. And that's why it was very compelling to watch then. But again, unless you tape traded or you lived over there, you didn't really know that existed. I mean,
Yeah.
unless you reached, you know. So it doesn't get talked about, but it's a big part of today's evolution into women's wrestling.
Yeah.
A niche part there.
Yeah. Um, final thoughts for me. I we did talk about a lot of uh, the women. Like I'm thinking of Luna Vachon with
Yeah,
Sable,
yeah,
where she had to, and this isn't disrespectful towards Sable at all. It's just how things were.
yep,
But Luna had to go out there and make her look like $1,000,000 and
and did.
put her over. And from what I understand, Luna and Sherry throughout the years were put in situations like that.
Yeah, yeah, and 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 women that weren't up to their level, but again, that was that was the way the culture was back then. It was just because there was a lack of women in the business like there is today, and how it was treated back then.
Yeah,
So and Luna today would have been, man, if she was on today's roster, forget about it. She'd be one of the top women on the show,
yeah,
you know, just in personality, never mind her skills in the ring.
yeah,
Because Luna was nuts. Like,
yeah,
and go to find out it was legitimate. She was nuts.
yeah,
So that kind of plays into it. But uh and Sherry too, badass woman, but man, uh what could have been if they opened the floodgates back then,
yeah,
but something was amiss.
yeah. But not anymore.
No, not anymore, thankfully. And but all these women deserve a mention because they're all a part of this whole gearbox that makes what we see today possible, you know,
Yeah,
all mentioned because now we're able to look at that and say, yeah, now it's the show. It's the show, you know.
yeah,
It's not just part of the show, it's the show. Because you take that out, nope.
yeah.
So
It's no longer a completed product.
nope.
And I think it is, good to say, should it have been this way back then? It should have. But I don't think it's helpful or useful to ignore progress as well. I know things needed to change. There were some women who made those changes happen so that we could be in today's day and age and be privileged to watch the women's division as it is now.
And I'm glad you brought up that word privilege because it is a privilege to see such a dynamic roster like that in our rings today, that we watch, and we can sit back and we can enjoy it just like the fans that we are, you
Yeah,
know.
perfect. All right. Any closing words?
uh just that the closing words I have are I'm real happy we did this episode today. This makes me smile so much because it's just one of those subjects that just it just never gets talked about that much, and I'm glad we were able to talk about it today.
Yeah, perfect.